I want to thank you today for joining. God bless you. I hope that you are doing well. Hopefully all things are going well with you and your family. And I want to kind of jump into it. And I thank you. And please, feel free, jump into the chat, jump into things. Let's talk about this. I hear this question come up a lot. How long did ancient Egypt last exactly? And sometimes that could be a tricky question, because does it last into the Greco-Roman period? Is that actually ancient Egypt? Is that Kemet? Is that Kemet proper? Or is that not Kemet? Let's just talk about some of the events that led to that as we can jump in this. And I'll say up front, I appreciate so much your support. I thank you for supporting me. If you are a member, I very much appreciate it. And we're working on another resource that will make available to you. You can support me by becoming a member. It's only $4.99 a month. I offer not only videos, but also things that you can download, resources that you can download and read more about this so you can get more into it. And it's not just videos, it's actually being able to dig in. So it's only $4.99 a month. I appreciate your support and all that you do with that. So let's get in. Let's start talking about how long did ancient Kemet last? And please like and share this with somebody. How long did it last? And what does that mean for us? And you can kind of see up top here, I have more than 3,000 years, which is kind of a little bit of a giveaway, right? A little bit of a giveaway in terms of how long it lasted and what things are going on with it. That's a bit of a giveaway. But as we start to think about that, it really is important for us to stop back and kind of look at that timeline, because when we think about that timeline, not very many societies and cultures have lasted for more than 3,000 years. And that's one of the reasons why it's so significant. And let's talk about not just how long it lasts, but why did it last? What was the cohesive thing that was bringing them together that made them last that long of a period of time? And so let's talk about that and let's jump into that. And as we talk about this timeline of ancient Kemet, we're going to go through more than 3,000 years of history. So if you can see that. So as we start over here, we're going to go to 3100 and kind of talk about things all the way up to 300 BC and beyond. What are some significant things for us to think about? So it's a long period of time in history. And as you start to think about it, more time passed from between, when the pyramids were made until the time of the birth of Jesus in the current era, then it's passed between that, 1 BC and 0, if you will, all the way up to now. So that's 2,000 years ago is what we consider the common era. But the pyramids themselves are way older than 4,600 years. They're way older than that. They're older than that. And so you start to get an idea that the history of ancient Kemet is long and is drawn out, and there's a lot that goes into it. So let's start jumping into it and kind of digging that a bit, because as you start to look at that, now I'll be sharing our resources and I'll be working on this resource to make it available to members very shortly, but I'm going to kind of preview it here a little bit. But that whole 3,000 years of history, right? The old kingdom, if you think about ancient Kemet, it's starting in about 3100 BC. So if you take a look at this up here in the upper right hand corner on the screen here, you'll notice that Kemet is kind of separated into upper and lower Kemet. And when you hear about upper and lower Kemet, you probably know by now that talks about the two lands, the lower land, which is in the north, and the upper land, which is in the south. And when did they come together? How did they join? So the joining of the two lands happened around 3100 BC or thereabouts. And it's very important to note, because as we think about longevity and things that have been going on with ancient Kemet, as we think about this, thank you so much for joining. As we think about longevity and things that go on with ancient Kemet, it's important to know that just because the two lands joined, just because they became one land, as you look up there, and they joined politically, it doesn't mean there wasn't a culture before that. So when we think about ancient Kemet, a lot of times we think about the political entity that is Kemet, and sometimes people will not count a ruler if they were ruling over just the northern part or just ruling over the southern part. I think it's all significant. And the culture is what makes a difference. The culture is what makes this entire society last for so long and last beyond, many societies and beyond sometimes what we think about it. So that culture becomes a significant part. So the culture is really in place before they become a kingdom, before they're united under one rule, if you will. That culture is already in place. So before 3100 BC, they already have a calendar, they already have writing, they already have a lot of the aspects of their religion in place already before 3100 BC, before 5,100 years ago. They already had many of these things, like I said, a calendar and writing and so forth already in place. And there were certain things in terms of burial practices, as well as certain things in terms of just practices they did with the dead, and some things they had religious practices, veneration for cattle, a veneration for the star Sirius, the brightest star in the sky, and how it rises in a certain period of time every year, and it coincides with the flooding of the Nile. All of that was a part of their culture and things that they look at well before Kemet became a country, before it became an entity. So as you start to think about that and ask yourself, how long did ancient Kemet last, just think about that. We're talking about beyond just the time that they were a political entity. We're also talking about their culture. So you can find aspects of their culture going back to 4000 BC and beyond, right? Even beyond that. And then I'm sure there's some people in the chat who have some very important things to say, some things that kind of that jump into you. You find things that happen even beyond that 3,100 years ago, 4,000 BC. There are things happening with respect to that culture as well. So as we're talking about that, and we're jumping into that old kingdom takes place. And the old kingdom goes from around 3100 BC, although they kind of consider it starting around 2649, just because some things were happening politically and architecturally and things of that nature, and running until about 2100 BC or thereabouts, you have the old kingdom lasting. So the old kingdom lasted, if you think from just the first part, not just what scientists call the old kingdom, but the first part of Kemet's history really lasts for over 1,000 years. It lasts for about 1,000 years, from about 3100 BC to just about 2100 BC. It's lasting, and it's a significant time. It's a time where they are building the step pyramids are being built, the pyramids of Giza, the great pyramids of Giza. Many magnificent things are happening. You have the pyramid texts, which are some of the earliest religious writings in the world, are being written inside the tombs of kings from the 5th dynasty. And this is King Sahure, who is a king in the 5th dynasty. The pyramid texts are being written then. Not only do you have that, you have other types of writing. You have didactic writing, like the teachings of Mentuhotep, the teachings of Kajimni, these really spiritual and moral teachings. All of this is going on in the Old Kingdom, the first 1,000 years of Kemet's history. So you think about a lot of countries around now, even in countries in the West and the United States, we haven't been around for 1,000 years. It hasn't been 1,000 years. So their first part of their country, if you will, and their political entity lasted for 1,000 years. And after you get out of that 1,000-year period, you start to transition into additional things that are happening for ancient kingdom. You start to get into the Middle Kingdom. And this gentleman up here, who you see at the top, he is Mentuhotep II. He's the founder of the Middle Kingdom. And that was a period of time in the Middle Kingdom, a period of time where there was some disruption. It was a disruption in ancient Kemet's political union, if you will. So you had a situation where the two lands separated, the upper and lower part of Kemet separated, and they became, disunified, and there's been some disunification and dysfunction there. But that did not mean that the culture stopped. So just because they kind of tore apart, just like you've had like a civil war in the United States, people don't necessarily consider that to be a time where the country was not existing, even though you still had people trying to form their own country, if you will. That was inappropriate. What they did, obviously, that was not appropriate, But just because they were politically disunified does not mean that their culture stopped. And so with respect to ancient Kemet, they had, their religion was continuing to go on. And one of the main things that a lot of people look at as being the religious culture of ancient Kemet is its temples. And when we think about when ancient Kemet stopped, that's what a lot of people look at. When do they stop servicing the temples? When do they stop believing in religion? When do they stop having the things that are a part of their culture that makes them go from one year to the next and to honor certain things? So when they stopped doing that, and when that stopped being supported, that's when a lot of people consider ancient Kemet fell. That's a lot of times when they consider it fell. So one of the important things that was a part of their culture that made it persist is things like this. These type of temples, and one of the main aspects of the temples, and this is the step pyramid of Dozier, and he has his own temple, is you would remember that person. It was a situation where you have a group of people who would continue to lift up your name. There were rites and ceremonies that were performed under the names of the gods that they believed in, but named in, Ptah or Amen. And they had an understanding of everything coming from one God, and they had God manifested in all these different things. But the idea is that you were manifesting God's will, and that you were remembering the people who lived on the earth, who served in your kingdom and in your area, or members of your family, and you kept up the memory of them in a certain way, through certain rites, through certain things that you perform. That was a major part of their culture. So their idea of God, who they believed in, what they look. God bless you. I so appreciate it, Sahure. I appreciate it. Thank you so much. Who they believed in, their idea of God was significant and central to their culture. That's what that was about. And so when you think about them, that moved them on from year to year. And when you look at that, and I'd be interested if someone has found out about it, please put it down in the comments. I haven't found these major battles that took place in ancient Kemet where they wanted to kill each other over what they believed when it comes to God. That their idea of God and this person's idea of God, if you were someone living in in the northern part of Kemet versus the upper part of Kemet, and you had a veneration for our men. God manifests as a men, and someone in Memphis, in the city of Ptah, looked at Ptah as being a manifestation of God. They didn't kill each other over that. They seem to be able to respect each other. They seem to be able to kind of ameliorate and to amalgamate and to get along and to say, well, then it's Amen Ra, or it's Ptah Tim. It's we're going to understand that God is manifested in all these ways, and you may call it Ptah, we may call it Amen, but we're not killing each other over that. So when you start to think about Kemet, it's still lasting, and it's amazing that they had a way of looking at each other's idea and perspective of God. And while one person may have looked at one aspect of God and said that is the only God, and somebody else may look at a different aspect and say this is the highest God, they didn't kill each over that. They continue to support each other. They continue to worship. They continue many times to worship the same gods. They continue many times to share amongst the same temples, even during periods where they had disruption, even during periods where, before the Middle Kingdom started, and periods after that, they continue to do that. And that becomes a significant thing that we look at because their culture exists, and then it allows them to be able to come back and unify politically. So after the old kingdom, after that first kind of disruption, if you will, in the old kingdom, and the middle kingdom comes, and Mentuhotep comes from the south. He comes from where Waset is, near Thebes, where Thebes is today, and he and his family, his forefathers, his grandfather, his father, his forefathers begin to unite Kemet again. And as they unite Kemet again, they usher in a whole period of more than 400 years, some 400 years of peace and stability and growth, once again under one land. And the only reason they're able to have that political unity is because there's also religious and moral unity. There's a religious unity and a cultural unity that allows them to continue to let their politics go on, even during periods of disruption. And that happens again after the Middle Kingdom, because the Middle Kingdom does things like they begin to build forts in Lower Nubia and stretching into part of the very first part of Upper Nubia. They begin to do building projects and do all kinds of things that they're looking at in terms of building projects and things that may happen with Mentuhotep. They do a lot in the Middle Kingdom to advance architecture, to advance the borders of Kemet, to do things with trade, expand their trade, like I said, in terms of forts into Lower Nubia, into parts of Upper Nubia as well. That happens in the Middle Kingdom. And then you have another period of disruption. There's another period of disruption that takes place. And then you start to have an intermediate period. And that's where the New Kingdom starts to come in. And right before the New Kingdom, around 1640 BC, you have a period of time where a people called the Hyksos come into power. They are people who are considered to be foreign rulers. That's literally what Hyksos refers to. It refers to a ruler from a foreign land. And they are controlling parts of Kemet, much of Kemet, and in particular in the north. They're controlling things in the north. And the people in the southern part in Upper Kemet, they're still practicing their ways. They are still, worshiping their God. They're still practicing their dynastic practices. And the folks in the Dynasty 17 and eventually Dynasty 18 begin to rise up. And this gentleman right here, almost the first, becomes the founder of the New Kingdom. And that happens around 1550 BC. And what he's doing there is he's uniting the land again. After another period of disruption, he's uniting the land again. And the New Kingdom becomes a kingdom where they have an explosion of art and of literature. This is probably the most famous time period in ancient Kemet's history, is the New Kingdom. It's probably the most famous time because as I kind of look at that and we put it up there, we kind of start going to where a lot of stuff is happening in the New Kingdom. It has, some of the most famous people you can listen. So King Tut, King Tutankhamen, you have Ahmose the First, you have Tutmos the First, you have Hatshepsut, you have Tutmos the Third, you have Akhenaten, you have Ramses the Second, you have Seti the First, you have all these very famous names from a historic perspective. They are all jammed in the New Kingdom. That's happening from around 1550 BC to about 1070 BC. That's the New Kingdom. And the reason why they're able again to come and to bring the country back together, unify the two lands, is because they have a similar culture. That culture is still in place. That culture is still in place in the northern part of Kemet, where they were separated. Even though they had foreign rulers, they were still pretty much practicing, supporting the temples, doing the rites that I talked about, performing those ceremonies, still believing in gods and their gods, still believing in God, and still having the ceremonies practice. It allowed for the political unification to happen once again after a second intermediate period. The New Kingdom comes about. And then you have a couple things that are interesting that happens that kind of jumps out at me as I start to think about this. And I start to look at this. They have a situation where after the New Kingdom is gone and fails again and falls, which it lasted for quite a bit, for hundreds of years, you have a period of time where Libyans and then the Kushites rule. And then you have the Kushites under King Pianki and Shabaka and Taharka. They begin to take over, and they begin to extend Kemet, they basically take what is Upper Nubia here, right here around Napata, which is today the Sudan. And that is in Kerma and Napata, their center of powers in Napata. They're already in power. The Kushite people have been there for a long time. They were occupied for a period of time by Kemet. They were taken over by Kemet for a period of time. But this time, after the New Kingdom, it was their turn to take over Kemet. It was their time, if you will. And they end up extending from the third and fourth cataract, fifth cataract of Nile, down here, not too far from Khartoum, all the way up through Lower Nubia, all the way up through Upper Kemet, eventually into Lower Kemet. So the Kushite people take over Kemet. And at this point in time, there's some interesting things that happen in their life and in Kemet in general, because you start to see, as we start to think about when does Kemet fall, when are some things challenging that happen. So at this period of time, when the Kushite people come into power and take over Kemet as a part of their power, you have another power that's on the horizon in what we call Syria today, Israel, Lebanon, and that's the Assyrian Empire. What is today Iraq? They're all up and down there. Babylon is in play, and these people the Assyrian Empire was nothing to play with. They were going to be one of the strongest and most powerful armies in the world at that time. They were emerging as that. And prior to the Kushites taking over Kemet, the New Kingdom under Thutmose III and Thutmose I and Amenemopetemhat, many people had stretched Kemet's borders all the way out into what is today Syria. They had gone all the way out to the Euphrates River, and just beyond the Euphrates River, actually have a boundary marker that you can literally find and see beyond the Euphrates River, if you will, showing the ancient Kemet has stretched that far. So by the time the ancient Kushites came and they took over all of Kemet, you can see up there, right, they took over all that land. The Assyrian Empire was in that part of the world where ancient Kemet had its power. And as you might imagine, a lot of things were happening. A lot of things were happening at that time. And one very famous thing happens, which I'll kind of share with you. And maybe you've already seen it and you've seen it in the Bible and it's referred to in the Bible, as you can take a look. And I'll just, this is King Taharka right here, showing King Taharka. If you go to Isaiah, if you ever look in the Bible, go to Isaiah 37:9, and it talks about King Taharka in the Bible. It talks about King Taharka of Ethiopia. But I'll tell you a little bit about what that means and what they're talking about. At this time, in around 701 BC, the Assyrian army was on a tear. They were killing up everybody. They were taking over all kinds of places. They had taken over Lachish, which is in basically the southern part of Israel today. Today's Israel. They'd taken over one of the areas there. They'd taken over other parts of Israel. And then they go to siege Jerusalem. And as they're going to siege Jerusalem, you can read this as Isaiah 37, and specifically 37:9. As they're going to siege Jerusalem, the king of Assyria at that time, Sennacherib, he is basically telling Israel, nothing's going to stop you. How is the Lord going to stop you? How is your God going to stop you? Stop me from taking over Jerusalem. All these other places I'm killing. All these other places had gods. All these other places had people to help them, and I took them over. What makes you think you're going to be any different? And so he's taunting them, and he has a huge army. And this apparently really happened. It was a siege on Jerusalem. And so as the Assyrian army is about to attack Jerusalem and surrounding it and basically having a siege to wait out, there's a part in the Bible that talks about the King Taharka, and it mentions King Taharka of Ethiopia. But at this time, around 701 BC, Taharka wasn't just king of Ethiopia. That was a general term that typically referred to not quite the Ethiopia we think today in terms of geography, but typically was referring to Kush and black people in general in Africa. And at this time, Kush was not only in control of Kush, it was in control of Kemet as well. So when Taharka is talking about Taharka's coming to meet the Assyrian army, it talks about that the king Sennacherib had gotten a message that the king of all the Ethiopian army, Taharka, is coming to meet him in battle. And this is 701 BC. And I find that very interesting because as he's doing that, as King Taharka is coming to meet him in battle, this is a significant thing because you find the Kushite kings and pharaohs leading their army into what is today present day Israel and present day Middle East, fighting the Assyrian army, one of the largest armies in the world. Now, we don't have all the specifics of what happened at that specific battle. We do know from biblical records that the siege just stopped. For some reason, it stopped kind of abruptly, and the Assyrian army did not end up taking Jerusalem. They did not end up taking over Jerusalem. It was supposedly a bad thing that happened to their army that killed a lot of people, and Sennacherib ends up dying shortly thereafter. So we don't know exactly what happened when Taharka went to meet him. Did Taharka go and protect Jerusalem? Did he fight the Assyrian army in another way? What happened in that battle that was about to take place when Taharka went to face the Assyrian army in 701 BC? So we don't exactly know, but we believe there was some type of face-off that took place because of the records. But we do know that the Assyrian king knew about Taharka coming, understood that Taharka was going to fight him, and this was 701 BC, and it would be years, and that at this time Taharka wasn't the king, so he would have been probably in line for he would be obviously would have been in line to be king. It probably would have been maybe his older brother or his uncle, maybe his uncle. It was like Shabaka may have been king, and he was like in charge of the army while Shabaka was the king, and probably Shabaka told him to go into King Shabaka probably told him to go into to fight the Assyrian army. But whatever happens, years pass before the Assyrian army makes another serious attack on Egypt. So you basically find the Cushite people standing up to the Assyrian army, fighting the Assyrian, engaging them in some type of way, some type of battle, some type of standoff, if you will, and then being able to live to tell. And a lot of places didn't live to tell of their fighting with the Assyrian army, and the Cushite people did. But decades would pass, and you would eventually end up having the Assyrian army would come back to Egypt, would come back to ancient Kemet, and in 671 BC they would take over Memphis. They would you would find Memphis being destroyed by the Assyrian people. So when they came, so this is 671 BC. And if we keep in mind, we're talking about a long period of history, right? So we're talking more than 3,000 years. We had 3100 BC when they started as a political unit. And now we're all the way into 671 BC when the Assyrian army attacks Memphis and takes over Memphis. And then they're fighting the Cushite, basically the Cushite forces that are in control of the army, the Cushite army and the Kemetic army. And apparently Kemet becomes a battlefield because it doesn't appear that it's like they just won and done. It appears that there's a bit of a battle that takes place between 671 BC and 663 BC. In 663 BC, the Assyrian army comes and they attack Thebes. And Thebes, as you know, is right there in the southern part of Kemet. That was a center of power for the southern part of Kemet. So they sacked Thebes. That's where the Temple of Karnak is. That's where Luxor is. That's where a lot of your monuments and buildings are. That was the center of power for the New Kingdom and the Middle Kingdom. And the Cushite people, it's interesting, the Cushite kings leave. They essentially leave when Thebes is sacked in 663, but they don't leave completely. Amenemopetemhat II, who we were talking about yesterday and the day before that, who is the God's wife of men, a priestess who was basically in charge of the temple at Karnak, she stays. She doesn't leave. And the Assyrian army, they basically just fight them, kill a lot of people, and then leave. And then they set up another group of people, which would become the 26th dynasty from the northern part of Kemet, to be their kind of puppet government, to kind of be their vassals, if you will, their puppet government. But the Cushite people don't completely leave, which I think is very interesting. And I talked about yesterday how Psamtik I makes a transition between Amenemopetemhat, who was a Nubian priestess at the Temple of Karnak, so his daughter could become in charge of the Temple of Karnak. All that's happening around 663 and 661 BC. All that's happening. And so you still have, and I want to kind of point this out, you still have the culture in place. The Assyrian army does not destroy the culture of ancient Kemet. They don't stop worshiping the gods. They don't stop any of the ceremonies. The priests are still in power. The priestesses like Amenemopetemhat II, she's still in power. The culture is still going on. The faces that are being made, the things that are being done, these things are still happening and still taking place even in 663 BC after the Assyrian army attacks Kemet. So that becomes a significant part. But the other thing that's really interested me that I want to point out, I don't know if you've thought about this, and maybe you have, but I wanted to point this out because I think this is an interesting part that comes about. You then have around 612 BC, the Assyrian army is destroyed. The empire of Assyria is destroyed. Its strongholds that are in northern Iraq, which is today northern Iraq, Nineveh and Assur, they were taken over and they were destroyed. And so the Assyrian empire is destroyed in around 612. At that time, and this is an image of Psamtik, most likely Psamtik the first of the 26th dynasty. And the 26th dynasty is that which took over after the Kushite dynasty left Kemet and just went back to Kush and just kept ruling Kush for another 1,100 years, another 1,000 years, which we'll talk about that. We'll get into depth into that, what they did for another 1,000 years after, still running Kush. But the 26th dynasty, when the Assyrian empire was destroyed in about 612 BC, it left a vacuum. So as you know, this was a powerful army. It was one of the more powerful armies historically in history, the Assyrian army. They were killing everybody in that area. They were taking over a lot of places. Well, they themselves, they got killed themselves. They themselves were also destroyed and attacked. And it left a vacuum in that area of the world, in the northeast of where Kemet is. And what happened was the 26th dynasty then starts to make their own moves. And they go down into Nubia under Psamtik II and they attack Napata. Maybe they're mad because of what the Nubian army had been fighting the Assyrian army, and they were basically Assyrian Assyrian, vassals, Assyrian puppets, if you will. Maybe they were mad because of that. And they maybe it was kind of like a revenge type of thing because of the war that was taking place between the Cushites and the Assyrians. But they also start to go into places in the Northeast. So as you start to think about Kemet and where it's located and all the things that are taking place, think about northeast of ancient Kemet. This area right there where we call it the Middle East today, where you may have Lebanon, Syria, Israel. The 26th dynasty starts to make inroads in there. And it's very interesting because it appears that their center of power was in the north. Their center of power was not in the south. And so when they began to raise armies, the 26th dynasty, they raised armies not only from people from Kemet, but they raised armies from other places. So they got people from Greece. They got Greek soldiers to come. And this is 600 BC. This is before Socrates is born. This is before Aristotle, before Plato. This is before all of that. This is before Alexander the Great. These are Greek people, Greek soldiers who are coming to ancient Kemet in 600 BC to fight under the 26th dynasty and to be mercenaries, to be foreign mercenaries. And I wonder if anybody's thought about that, if you guys have heard that, if you've had that kind of thought about it and really let that sink in, what that meant, because to me it becomes significant because we talk about ancient Greece getting a lot of resources and intelligence and influence from ancient Kemet, but we never really talk about with specificity how. Sometimes we do talk about, the library at Alexandria, and we may talk about people like Socrates and various people who went to visit ancient Kemet. But even before there was a Socrates, long before 400 BC, there were Greek soldiers under the 26th dynasty serving in Kemetic armies in 600 BC. And it wasn't just them. There were people from Phoenicia, which is on kind of the western coast of the Mediterranean, right there in today, what is Palestine, if you will. There were soldiers from what is today modern day Turkey. So the 26th dynasty, they were sourcing soldiers from various places. The other thing they did, though, with Greece, though, there was a special relationship they had with Greece. So not only were they bringing people, they set up a particular town. And this particular town had a number of different, and I'll try to point it out to you. This particular town had a number of different things with respect to it. It was in the Delta, in the western part of the Delta. So think about where the Nile goes out to the Mediterranean Sea and that whole area that kind of blossoms there. That's the Delta. In the western part of it, it was a specific town that was basically a Greek trading post. It was a settlement that was set up as a trading town. So just like you had trading posts in Kemet, in the southern part of Kemet, if you look down around here where Aswan, where Lower Nubia meets Upper Nubia, there were trading posts. Elephantine was a trading post area. All that whole area was a trading post set up to receive products and as a stop, if you will, for products that were coming from further south, from ancient places in Kush and further south in Central Africa, products that would come like ivory and gold or incense and panther skins and things like that. There were places along the way that were set up as trading settlements, and the southern part of Kemet was one of them. Well, by the time the 26th dynasty came into play, they did the exact same thing for Greece. By the time 600 BC, they did the exact same thing for Greece. They set up a trading settlement in the northern part in the Delta. And so you have a good couple 150 years or more of interaction with specific Greek people as the Greek city-states are developing, where you have a trading platform settlement really set up between ancient Egypt, ancient Kemet, and Greece, where influence was coming. And you not only had that particular settlement, you had places like Memphis where they had certain quarters for different people who were soldiers from different parts of Kemet. And this happened later on in Egypt history, but I'm talking about 600 BC. In addition to that, you had Greek soldiers and Greek people in various parts of the Delta. So when you start to understand that there was a relationship, and I don't even think the Greek people didn't hate ancient Kemet. We just like to look and think that there was this separation and there was this big difference, but there was a long history of relationship there before Socrates, before Alexander the Great comes. That's already in place for hundreds of years before he comes, because there are Greek settlements in ancient Kemet as a part of what the 26th dynasty started and the Greek soldiers that were being used. And so you have ancient Kemet doing that. But the interesting part about this, although this is going on, and this is 600 BC, you still don't have a change in their culture. Kemet's culture persists. The Greek people will come, the people come, they simply just amalgamate. Kemet was the power, and it was the historic power. It had been around by this time for thousands of years, and people recognize it as such. So its power and its culture and its ceremonies and its temples were still being served, still being used in Upper Kemet and Lower Kemet. It was still a power. Then you end up having about 525 BC, you have the Persians. The Persians come and they take over, they take over Kemet. They end up coming in and they make Kemet like a vassal state. So you have King Darius, some various famous people you hear about in the Bible as well. This is the period of time where they're taking over Kemet. But they're not serving like as local rulers. They're not trying to come and just take over Kemet and make Kemet be Persian. They are letting local people do what they have to do, and they're still letting the culture persist. They're not there to like take over and change everything. The culture still persists even under the Persians. And then you have another period of time where local people in Kemet pop back up. They fight back up and they fight off the Persians. And you have another resurgence of Kemetic rule where they unify the country, kick out the Persians, beat them, and they come in control again. So you have a series of situations where the Kemetic people, even though there are periods of disruption, continue to bring back political unity. And part of that is because their culture still exists and there was still connection and still fighting them. And still fight. And it wasn't until 343 BC that the Persians came back, because they were trying to come back. They came back again, took over Kemet again. And then in 332 BC, that's when when Alexander the Great came. When Alexander the Great came in 332 BC, and he was there to kick out the Persians, to fight the Persians. And Egypt was one of the, obviously the main prize, one of the areas that you wanted to take control of. Alexander the Great defeats the Persians, takes over and takes Egypt as a part of that. And so you have around, a lot of people will consider that to be the time where things change in ancient Kemet. You have a situation where once the Greeks take over in 332 BC, the country never returns back to local rule. It never returns back to native rule, to the people there. It's then ruled by other people, right? And the Greeks then rule it. So that's when some people think about the fall of ancient Kemet being around 332 BC. But even when the Greeks came, the Greeks didn't completely change the culture. A lot of what they did was just try to take what they heard about Asar and they made Asar Osiris, or they heard about Set and they made Set Isis. And they tried to take some of the parts of Kemetic culture and religion and merge it with their own. I mean, that's kind of well documented. You can see the history that documents that. And so you don't get until you get into the Roman times, about 30 BC, when the Romans finally stopped supporting the temples. The Romans stopped doing, we're not paying anymore. We're not giving all this money to the temples. They stopped supporting it. So somewhere around that 300 BC to 30 BC is when you start to see the culture change. You start to see things being represented differently. Things start to be done differently. And finally, after still a period of another 100 or a couple hundred years or so, you find the temple stop being supported and the religion is not practiced. The culture has changed and the culture is different. So I just wanted to share that gives you kind of a long history, if you will, of ancient Kemet's culture, and understand that this lasted for well over 3,000 years, well over 3,100 years. This culture lasted for well over 3,000 years, beyond many things that we see in history and many things that we see today. So I just wanted to share that because that was a significant time period in terms of what they do it. And I'm looking, thank you so much, Sarah. I appreciate that. I'm looking at that. So that becomes a significant thing to look at. So I just wanted to share that. So when you think about ancient Kemet, think about 3,000 years of history. Think about more than 3,000 years of history, and know that the culture of ancient Kemet lasted before the country started as a political unit, and even after the country ended in terms of native rule, the culture was still there. So God bless you. Thank you so much for listening. Please share this with somebody and tell them about it. Talk to you soon.